You know, one of the intense pleasures, and I work as an anthropologist and explorer in residence at the National Geographic Society, and one of the great pleasures of travel is the opportunity to live amongst those who have not forgotten the old ways, who still feel their past in the wind, touch it in stones polished by rain, taste it in the bitter leaves of plants. And just to know that in the Amazon, jaguar shamans still journey beyond the Milky Way, or that in the high Arctic, the myths of the Inuit elders still resonate with meaning, or that in the high Himalaya, the Buddhists still pursue the breath of the Dharma, is to remember the central revelation of anthropology, and that is the idea that the world into which you were born does not exist in some absolute sense, but is just one model of reality, the consequence of one particular set of adaptive and intellectual choices that your lineage made, however successfully, many generations ago. But whether it is the nomadic Panan in the rainforests of Borneo, the voodoo acolytes in Haiti, the yak herders in the slopes of Chomolungma, the eagle hunters of Central Asia, or the Mongolian shaman of the great grasslands of the Asian steppe, all of these peoples teach us that there are other ways of being, other ways of thinking, other ways of orienting yourself in social and spiritual space. And that's an idea that, if you think about it, can only fill you with hope. Now, together, the myriad of cultures of the world make up an intellectual, social, spiritual web of life that envelops the planet and is as important to the well-being of the planet as is the biological web of life that you know as a biosphere. And you could think of this cultural web of life as being an ethnosphere. And you could define the ethnosphere as being the sum total of all thoughts and ideas and beliefs and intuitions brought into being by the human imagination since the dawn of consciousness. The ethnosphere is humanity's great legacy. It's a symbol of all that we've achieved and the promise of all that we can achieve as a wildly creative species. And just as the biosphere is being severely impacted with the loss of habitat and the concomitant loss of plant and animal life, so too is the ethnosphere, but if anything at a far greater rate. No biologist, for example, would dare suggest that 50% of all plants and animals are moribund, because it simply is not true. And yet that, the most apocalyptic scenario in the realm of biological diversity, scarcely approaches what we know to be the most optimistic scenario in the realm of cultural diversity. And the great indicator of this, of course, is language loss. When each of you in this room were born, there were 7,000 languages spoken on Earth. Now, a language isn't just a body of vocabulary or a set of grammatical rules. A language is a flash of the human spirit. It's a vehicle through which the soul of each particular culture comes into the material world. Every language is an old-growth forest of the mind, a watershed of thought, an ecosystem of social and spiritual possibilities. And of those 7,000 languages spoken the day that you were born, today fully half aren't being whispered into the ears of infants, which essentially means they're on their way to extinction. And there are many people who say, well, what's wrong with that? I mean, wouldn't the world be a better place if we all spoke one language? Wouldn't communication be facilitated? Wouldn't it be easier for us to get along? And my retort to that is always to say, what a great idea. But let's make that one universal language Inuktitut. Let's make it Yoruba. Let's make it Cantonese. Let's make it Haida, Quechua, Navajo. And suddenly you begin to feel, as a native speaker of English, what it would be like to be enveloped in silence, to have no ability to pass on the wisdom of your ancestry or to anticipate the promise of your descendants. And yet that dreadful plight is indeed the plight of somebody somewhere on Earth roughly every fortnight, because on average, every 2 weeks, some elder dies and carries with them into the grave the last syllables of an ancient tongue. But what is it that really is being lost? Well, the greatest revelation of science in my lifetime has come from population genetics, because finally the geneticists have proven it to be true, something that philosophers have always hoped to be true, and that is the fact that we truly are all brothers and sisters. We are quite literally cut from the same genetic cloth. Studies of mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome leave absolutely no doubt whatsoever that all of humanity is descended from roughly 150 people who walked out of Africa 55,000 years ago, and then in 40,000 years, 2,500 generations, spread our imaginations to every habitable corner of the planet. Population genetics has proven that race is a fiction. The human genome is a continuum. There is nothing to the notion of race. We are all cut from the same genetic cloth. Now, the corollary of that, which is so exciting in terms of social anthropology, is that if you accept the fact that we're all cut from the same genetic cloth, we all share the same sacred endowment, then how a people chooses to use that raw human genius is simply a matter of choice and cultural orientation. We have this sort of conceit in the West that while we've been indulging technological wizardry, the other peoples of the world have somehow been intellectually idle. Nothing could be further from the truth. There is no notion of progress in the affairs of communities. Technological innovation may have been our calling, but by contrast, for the people of the Australian outback, the Aboriginal people who first walked across southern part of the Asian continent to reach Australia by 55,000 years ago, for them the calling was something quite different, as you'll see, to unwrap the complex threads of memory inherent in a myth and find a way to live always on the continent in stasis, as it was at the time of the rainbow serpent. So there is this old Victorian idea that there's some kind of ladder to success that inevitably places Victorian England at the apex of a pyramid that slopes down to the so-called primitives of the world, has been absolutely exposed and ridiculed as a colonial conceit that it was. But what do I mean by different peoples making for different possibilities of life itself? Well, I recently traveled with my friend Mathieu Ricard in Tibet making a film called The Buddhist Science of the Mind. Why did we use that term science? What is science but the empirical pursuit of the truth? What is Buddhism but 2,500 years of direct observation as to the nature of mind? In fact, Mathieu said a wonderful thing. He said that Western science was a major response to minor needs. We spend all of our lifetimes trying to live to be 100 without losing our teeth. In Tibet, we spend all of our lifetimes trying to understand the nature of existence. He said that billboards in the West celebrate naked teenagers in underwear. Our billboards are money walls, prayers for the well-being of all sentient creatures. And with Mathieu's guidance, we embarked on a series of journeys, which I'll tell you about a little bit further in this presentation. But I want, for the moment, to slip into the greatest culture sphere ever brought into being by our imagination, and that is, of course, Polynesia. A quarter of the surface of the planet, tens of thousands of islands flung like jewels upon a southern sea. I recently sailed in the Hokulea, which is a recreated sacred canoe, the same kind of vessel that carried the Polynesian diaspora all the way from what is now Melanesia, all the way across eventually to Rapa Nui. And the sailors, even today, of the Polynesian Voyaging Society can name 250 stars in the night sky. They can sense the presence of distant atolls of islands beyond the visible horizon simply by watching the reverberation of waves coming across the hull of their vessel, knowing full well that every island group in the Pacific has its own unique refractive pattern that can be read with the same perspicacity with which a forensic scientist would read a fingerprint. Their sailors in the darkness of the hull of the sacred canoe can distinguish as many as 5 sea swells moving through at any one point in time, distinguishing waves that are caused by local weather disturbances from the deep currents that pulsate across the ocean and can be followed with the same ease with which a terrestrial explorer would follow a river to the sea. Indeed, if you took all of the genius that allowed us to place a man on the moon and applied it to an understanding of the ocean, what you would get is Polynesia.